All right, well, last week, as I've just said, was a big week for Australia's international relations, with Prime Minister Scott Morrison travelling to the United States for a state dinner with President Donald Trump, hitting back at critics regarding Australia's climate record in a speech to the UN's General Assembly. And as soon as the wheels hit the tarmac back here at home, off he went to regional Australia to announce a much-needed extra $100 million for our drought-affected rural communities. Here for his take on all of this, fresh from his time in the US travelling with the Prime Minister, is the Australian newspaper's political editor, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, I'm going to ask for your observations. Great to have you on the show as always, but particularly having just come back from the States. You've been to many of these trips before. My observation, having been behind the scenes at a number of these international events, is there can be a manufactured relationship or rapport between leaders, but you can see in subtle movements when the cameras aren't following every moment whether they actually get along or not. And it seemed to me that there was a real genuine relationship there between the Prime Minister and the President. And what I'm asking you, does that bode for the future for Australia?
Good evening, Peter. Look, I think there is no doubt that there was a personal chemistry between Scott Morrison and Donald Trump, possibly more from Donald Trump's side than Scott Morrison's side. And I've been on these US trips with every Prime Minister since John Howard, and was on the state visit trip that John Howard had for George W. Bush. There's no doubt there was a very strong rapport between George Bush and John Howard, and that helped Australia. It helped the relationship and enabled so that the US President was actually listening to the Australian President. We had a place at the table, as it were, when all of those things were unfolding in Afghanistan, Iraq and so on. I think that Julia Gillard had a very clear and warm relationship with President Obama. That was also manifest when President Obama came to Australia, and Julia Gillard announced that there would be a US Marine base in Northern Australia, which incidentally China didn't like. We've seen cooler relationship between Kevin Rudd and George Bush, although it was polite, particularly from George Bush, but that was one which there was clearly a cooler relationship. I think that the relationship where Donald Trump is actually looking for friends now, Australia has been, and that was the whole theme of this trip, the 100 years of mateship, which was Joe Hockey's idea, but the fact that Australia is the oldest and certainly most reliable friend of the United States was the prime point of this trip, and the prime point from the President in making it into a state visit. Only the second since John Howard in 2006 for an Australian Prime Minister, and only the second for any leader, which was since President Macron of France, which turned to custard, by the way, when he criticised President Trump in the Congress. But the point here is that this trip was a success. It will help Australia's relations with Scott Morrison being able to communicate directly with President Trump on a level that I think it was heightened than a higher level of friendship and rapport than, say, there was with Malcolm Turnbull and President Trump. I think if Scott Morrison made one mistake on this trip, it is that he didn't work on expectations. He didn't manage the expectations. He said quite correctly, the main reason for this trip is to build a relationship and to have a greater rapport with President Trump. But by not making more of it, he allowed Anthony Albanese to build unrealistic expectations about the trip, that somehow Scott Morrison's visit to the US was going to ease trade tensions between China and the US, or come back with some solution to the trade war. That was fantasy. It was never going to happen. It was a highly political move from Anthony Albanese, and it gave him the basis to then launch what I think was a miscalculated attack, but just the same, it gave him the basis to then accuse Scott Morrison of not achieving anything as far as the China trade war with the US was concerned, and then being accused of taking pot shots at China. This was just nonsensical,
yeah, I thought
really.
His politicking was quite extraordinary. It doesn't normally happen like that for people at home. There's usually a sort of an accord that when leaders travel overseas, that politics aren't played either by the counterpart in Australia, but certainly by the principal travelling overseas. It's a long-standing protocol. It seems that it was breached there by Anthony Albanese, but it's a combination of Trump and China, red rag to a Labor bull. Just before we go, I want to get onto some domestic issues, but you were there obviously at the tail end of a hectic week. The Democrats have moved on this inquiry. Now, if you read some of the Democrat-leaning press, this will bring down the president. My mind says this is exactly the sort of fillip the Trump campaign would relish, being taken to task by the Democrats. Where do you think that will end up, Dennis?
Look, I think it is a risk for the Democrats. It is clear that President Trump, in his discussion with the Ukrainian president, was saying, oh, look, it was explicit. He wanted them to investigate Joe Biden's son. It was also to his political advantage to have them do that, and particularly for them to come up with anything they could. It was also in the same conversation where he was talking about military aid that he had suspended only a few days before. I think the message is pretty clear, and I think the Republican argument is, oh, he didn't actually say, I want you to do this, the old quid pro quo argument. I don't think that really stands up. But having said that, I don't think that this is criminal behaviour from Donald Trump. I don't think it does fulfil the whistleblower's claim that it's treasonous, and I don't think it's grounds for impeachment. Now, I think that the Democrats are playing into Donald Trump's hands here as we go into a US presidential election year next year. He is going to claim once again the media, the Democrats, the New York Times, CNN are all against him. You can't believe what he's saying, what they're saying. He's fighting against China. They're trying to undermine him, and he's going to appeal to all of those middle American workers in Ohio, all of those places where he's going to really be pushing the line that they are out to get him, and he's going to really strengthen his vote. I think the Democrats are running a very big risk here, and let's remember, Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives, by the Congress, and he went on to end his presidency with high approval ratings. I think Donald Trump could equally survive an impeachment from the Congress, and it's unlikely that they'll ever get the numbers in the Senate to have a full impeachment from both houses. So I think that this is a very big risk for the Democrats. Donald Trump will play it for all he can, and I think the evidence probably falls short. It may be improper, but I think it falls short of impeachment.